Also, I want to say thank you to the Lyon's Lectureship Series Committee for inviting me here to come and talk tonight about this very important topic about social justice and its place in academia. So thank you all for taking the time to come here tonight. This is a very important topic that we need to think about, so I'm really glad that you took the opportunity to do, because I'm sure you all feel just as strongly about it as I do. And also thank you for coming. So back in my RIT days, wow, it's good to be back. So can you find me? I look very much younger in this picture, but sometimes it's hard to even find myself, so once I take the second to look, if you look in the second row on the right, I'm sitting on the stairwell there. So that group was the Deaf Women's Club. It was set up, I believe, in 2004 or 2005. We called it Dove. I don't believe it's here anymore, but I see one or two Dove sisters here that came out tonight. So those were the deaf women who didn't want to be in any sort of Greek organization. They wanted to set up their own women's organization, so we established Dove. It was a club here on campus. You can see it up there in my picture. So I included this in the start of my PowerPoint because I was looking for pictures of college and I realized I couldn't find anybody because there was no Facebook back when I was in college. So I had to look through my scrapbooks, had to go up to my attic to find the right picture, and I realized that there were very, very few pictures of me in college because this was pre-Facebook. But now, if I look through my time while I was at Gallaudet, there are many pictures of me during my master's, but less from my undergrad. So I guess that's just age. So I attended EYF in 2000, as well as SOAR in the year 2001. I BSW, a class of 2005, and I understand that that program closed in 2007, so I was able to graduate with my BSW before that happened. I also married my RIT college sweetheart. We've been married for 6 years. He is deaf. His name is Tony Woodson. Owen. We have 2 children. My oldest is 5. So she has 5 going on 15, so she is a very sassy little girl, and my youngest is 2. My professors over the years have now become my friends as well as my mentors. And my friends have become my family, and my coworkers, my very strong relationships. And so that RIT connection has continued through today and has had a huge impact on my life as well. Honestly, being here at RIT was some of the best years of my life. I consider them my formative years. Typically when people think about the word formative, you think about a very small child, maybe age 2, 3, or 4, just acquiring language, learning all that new information. That's typically what we consider the formative time of somebody. But I feel that my personal formative years happened here at RIT because my family found out I was hard of hearing when I was 2 years old. So at that time, in my very, very young age, my family focused on teaching me how to speak well and kind of matched to that hearing culture. I was never asked what my favorite color was. I was never asked about my favorite book. Everything was focused on how I was speaking, the ability to read and write, and so forth. So I did grow up in a mainstream school. I was the only deaf student in my school as well, and I had my own personal thoughts, obviously, but they were never considered important. What was important was my ability to speak. Until I arrived here on RIT campuses when I realized that there were other deaf people like me that were able to sign, and that's where I did learn ASL, was here on campus at RIT. And I was finally be able to participate in classes and in those in-depth discussions. And so those are the formative time, that was the formative time of my life. That's when I really developed my critical thinking skills. So here, when I see students coming in from other countries, from other states, other towns, maybe they were the only deaf student in their school and their opinions were shut down and didn't matter. They were forced to go to the audiologist and fit into that medical model of deafness. They had to pay attention to their resource room teachers and everything that was focused on that being able to hear. But when those students come here, they're able to find their true identity. So that is where social justice can fit into the academic setting, those students being able to find their identities here. So on social media, now students have a lot more access to that type of information. In my time, I didn't have that, obviously, so it's very different. I wasn't able to find those people who were like me. It was a very small, people of color, deaf people from the same community. I couldn't find them back then. Now students have a lot more access to that type of information. So those are my RIT days back all those years ago, 12 years ago now. So just a little bit about my background, about what will frame my presentation today and my journey, how I got to where I am today. If you look at the top picture here, I'm the baby, if you can't tell. I was born in India, in a rural village that was very near the airport. It was very far from the hospital, 2 hours away from the nearest town. That's where I was born, and my family didn't know how I became deaf, but I was born premature and all of that. But my family never really found out I was deaf until we moved to America, and that's when we realized that I was deaf at age 2. So I started losing my hearing, and that's when the whole process started of trying to fit that audiological model when I was 2 years old. If you look at the next picture over here, this was when I was in preschool. My teacher at that time pushed my parents, well, really my mother, to learn sign language. But at that time, the doctors and the audiologists did not recommend teaching your children sign languages. They typically tried to get that away from most children. It's important to focus on the English, is what they said. So my mom followed what the doctor said, and we focused solely on spoken English. That also was before the ADA was passed, so I had no interpreters going through school. I was a product of New York City public schools. I am very proud of that, but I am a product of New York City schools. No interpreters and no accommodations growing up. I was the only deaf student in a mainstream program. In 5th grade, you can see this deaf girl over here. Her name is Gloria Farr. This is her name sign. She came from a deaf family and went to a deaf school and then moved to my school. And the resource room teacher decided that would be a good idea to put us in the same classroom with an interpreter just to see what would happen. And understand, I had no sign language skills at that time. This was my first experience with an interpreter right there. You can see her. Her name is Doris Velez. I have not seen her since then. I'm not sure where she is now. I'm lucky to even have found this one picture. But that was when my first exposure to ASL. And in 5th grade, I did really well. My grades were much better than they had been before, and then unfortunately Gloria moved back to California and my interpreting services were taken away. So then I had to rely solely on an oral interpreter. And if you see this picture to the far right, it's when I was in high school. I believe in my entire school system of over 1,000 students, I was the only deaf student. Therefore, I had no deaf identity. There was nobody I could relate to. Somebody was a person of color as well as deaf who signed. I didn't find anybody who was like me until I came to RIT, and I was able to find somebody who had similar philosophies as well as cultural values. So if you hold on to Gloria for 1 second, we will get back to her, so just keep her in mind. So when I did come here to RIT, my first year here, I remember one night I woke up and I couldn't hear. I thought that my hearing aid was broken. Kind of messed with it, and I went to the audiologist here on campus and asked if my hearing aid was broken, and they said that it seemed fine. And so they ran some audiological tests and realized that my hearing was gone overnight, just like that. It didn't really impact me as much here because I had already been exposed to sign language. I was exposed to ASL. And so it wasn't until I left Rochester that I really realized how deaf I was, because that was not as big of an impact on RIT's campus. So in my early 20s was when I did lose my hearing, and my father did at the same time as me, and my grandfather lost his hearing as well. So really there are 5 of us that are deaf in my family, but the 4 of them do not sign. I'm the only one who uses ASL. Some of them still live in India now. In 2017, India is just recognizing sign language as a language, so there's no video phones, there's no interpreters or deaf rights there, so they were not able to acquire sign language, as well as being late deafened. So sometimes dinner conversation with the five of us can be very interesting. There's a lot of yelling and lip reading, gesturing, trying to relate what other people are saying, and that is our dinner conversation these days. It's actually very interesting because we are a late deafened family, so just kind of a side note. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
And so tonight's presentation, I want to be talking about my journey as a student here in Rochester at RIT and at Gallaudet, and how those two really helped me internalize social justice issues. A professor at Gallaudet was teaching social work and seeing how social justice is within the teaching environment. And after that, being the director of the LaGuardia Community College program for the deaf, as an administrator, I'm trying to see how I can incorporate social justice into my roles there. The values of social justice have stayed consistent throughout the years, although I know that the framework has changed and how we talk about social justice has also changed. Interestingly enough, RIT had a very strong social work program, even though it closed down in 2007. But that program was so very crucial, and it was one of the few programs on campus that actually had a population that was half deaf and half hearing in their student population. There were many transfer students, many women, and it was such a valuable program. And when the college was deciding what the financial priorities were, what the strategic vision was, they decided that social work didn't fit that vision and closed it down. And I don't necessarily agree or support that decision. But in that program, the networking that we had with alumni, with professors, with students, gathering information, being able to apply statistics, but also have narratives that we were able to analyze, work with films, is something that we tried to do as we tried to keep the program running. We had a mini strike when we were trying to make sure that the campus would keep the program. And there were 5 students, and one of them was Gloria, my first deaf friend from elementary school who you saw previously. We were actually in the same class. And then there was also Genevieve DeGuire, and she was from Canada. We were the 3 deaf students, and then there were 2 hearing students who, the 5 of us together, went to the provost, went to the president, and gave all the reasons to tell them to decide to keep the program. So in a sense, we lost that battle, which was very demoralizing. But that at the same time was the first time that I realized that my person, as a deaf person, my expression, my voice was valued. That was the first experience that I had advocating and trying to convince a system to change. And so even though, in a sense, we lost that fight, there was something that I did gain from that I've carried with me. And also the understanding that in life you win some and you lose some. And so now, looking back, trying to fight for the social justice program was something that I kept. After having graduated from RIT, I didn't want to leave, but I had to go pursue my master's. I went to Gallaudet University to study social work. Funnily enough, my bachelor's in social work, all of us, my program, ended up going to Gallaudet for a social work master's. So we had the same graduating class, even though we were in different cities, different universities. That was kind of cool, all the same faces. We just transplanted over to Gallaudet. And once I entered Gallaudet in 2006, I think it was a month and a half later that there was a Gallaudet protest. It was BPN, Better President Now. And so there was another protest, another movement, another student resistance that popped up. I had done it at RIT, trying to convince the university to keep the social work program, and here it was again. I don't know how familiar you are with Better President Now, that movement, as compared to Deaf President Now, DPN. But I'm going to explain a little bit about what the protest itself looked like. DPN, Deaf President Now, was in 1977 when Gallaudet was looking for a new president. Up to that point, there had already been hearing presidents for the entirety of the life of the school. And so there were students who really shut down campus, protested, and worked with the administrators to win to have a deaf president be president of a deaf college, a deaf university. And that happened in 1988. And so, BPN, it was another interesting thing. Gallaudet had felt like the choice of a president did not match and accommodate what Gallaudet wanted as a university, and so another protest was held. And I'm trying to remember correctly, but I think it was over 1,000 people who marched to the Capitol. And there was a hunger strike that was also involved with that protest in front of the Gallaudet gate at the front of the university. There were several tents that were set up all over the campus, and the hunger strike was right there on the right of this picture if you look. And they stayed there for 1 month, 24/7, day and night. They never left. They stayed in one place every day. And for 1 month, they didn't eat anything. And it was hard to watch, honestly, to see students continue to get thinner and thinner. And over 80 students ended up being arrested within this march and within this protest. And there was a lot of going back and forth between the faculty and the staff and the student alumni, the SSA, which had been similar to the Deaf President Now moment, to see what values the students wanted in a new president. And so going on from here, I'm going to talk about my experience in witnessing and dealing with the hunger strike that happened during the BPN movement. I think it was about 18 people altogether who participated in the hunger strike. But those who continued the entire month, I think, were about 11 students. Each individual had their own reasons for striking, but they so valued Gallaudet. They so valued American Sign Language. They so valued deaf history. And for me, I didn't personally feel convicted toward hunger striking. That wasn't something that I necessarily thought of as my position. But I didn't necessarily think it was silly, and I didn't also want to slap them on the wrist. That wasn't my place. That was their perspective, that was their journey and how they wanted to participate with this movement. And I did feel very disturbed. They were sitting there in the front of campus all day and all night, getting thinner and thinner, and I felt so strongly about this, because they felt so strongly about the social justice issue, and I had to see that. It was right in front of me every day. And so every day after class, I would be able to go and talk with them for 1 month, and it was hard to watch. It was painful to watch that group and what they went through. Even though I didn't agree and I didn't participate, that gave me a sense of compassion that was important for them because they so valued the university and valued the deaf center that was there. After it seemed that the strike would be finished soon, I wondered who would be there for them, who would be able to take care of them. And so after the hunger strike was finished, I was able to get beds ready in the emergency room at the Georgetown University Hospital to be able to work out that all the services, interpreting services, were ready, that those who had been on the hunger strike would have transportation and would be able to have a van that everyone got into to go directly to the hospital to get IV and fluids. And so I was able to be behind the scenes. I had just graduated a month ago from RIT and I was in this new city, but I felt that it was so important to support them in that way. And so afterward, we were able to share stories and some solidarity. And I didn't ever think anything necessarily of that experience as my role as an ally or as my role as in my role as a community member. But I just thought of myself in that moment as a person who had compassion. Later, 2 years later, when I was graduating, they picked me to speak at the Gallaudet commencement ceremony, which I was so honored by because of my participation behind the scenes with the hunger strike. But thinking about that in retrospect, it's so important to think about the experiences of different people who have experienced oppression and where compassion and allyship and advocacy comes in as we provide a safe space for those people. And being an ally, that balance of considering all of those things is very important.
During my master's program at Gallaudet University, I was required to do research. And I didn't really know how I got to that point or made that decision for my research topic. I honestly don't remember, it was so long ago. But I decided to study acculturation of Latinx deaf women and compare them to other deaf women to see their identities and how that they integrated their identities into their person. So at that time, obviously, I am not Latina. I'm also not white. And so to do that research of those two separate groups, I was just a young, naive social work student. I wanted an A on my research paper. That was my top priority. That was my intention at that time. But really, looking back, I'm not sure if that was appropriate. Do I have the right to do that type of research without consulting with a Latinx expert, without making sure that my research was not culturally appropriative, or thinking that I had the right to study those two groups of people? So I'm not sure if I can 100% trust that that was the right decision that I made. My advisor told me to do specific things and I went along with it, but I did it kind of without thinking about it. So I'm not 100% sure if that did more good than harm. Is that something that I was able to do? So I was involved with qualitative research where I collected different narratives of deaf people from both of those groups, as well as did some statistical research as well. So I provided surveys, and I had a table of them, and I had different people, and I would have them come up, they'd fill them out, and I would have to collect different deaf people, and they would come fill out these surveys. And there was one deaf black student who wanted to participate in my research, and I had to tell them that they couldn't participate because they were not a part of this group. And they were hurt because they wanted to be involved with this research, but there was no really... I wasn't sure how I would be able to deal with that. I was researching these two very specific groups, but this was excluding this black deaf person that wanted to be involved because that community was not involved with my research at that time. So honestly, there was a lack of cultural sensitivity for sure at that time with me. So I was doing master's level research, but I feel like I should have known better. So I looked to my faculty advisor for that feedback, for that guidance and that support. And my faculty at Gallaudet was not very diverse at that time, but they should have the cultural competency and cultural sensitivity to be able to research those topics, but maybe myself, not fitting into those groups, it was not appropriate. So I wish I had had better mentors and taken the time to meet with the appropriate consultants and had that better cultural sensitivity training at the time. So this was a very humbling experience for me, something that I really had to delve into myself. I had to, as a deaf person of color, pressing my own deaf people of color, my community, so it was very humbling to recognize this. So from that experience has happened many times, I've realized, just over time. It's not intentional, but that doesn't mean that you should be allowed to oppress people in that way. So I want to stop that from coming up again and repeating in the future. So I finally graduated, good news. And I ran a nonprofit domestic violence agency as well as taught some social work, which I really enjoyed being a teacher. It was a very rewarding experience. I worked with a very large undergraduate class with 25 students and taught child abuse and welfare. We used case studies, role play, watched movies, analyzed them, etc. But I feel that my teaching was very by the textbook, if you know what I mean. We would learn the theory, and then we would try to apply that to real-world situations. We would learn the vocabulary and apply those words to real situations. But I feel that I probably could have gone deeper. maybe we're not a member of those case studies. Maybe we're not a member of those cultural groups. We don't know how those family lives are run. That's not our experience. So how could I have taught my students more cultural sensitivity and more cultural competency? So looking at that from a social justice perspective or an intersectionality perspective, using those theories, how do we apply that? It's important to take that time to critically think and delve deeper. And I wish that there were more opportunities for us as faculty to discuss these types of things. How do we define this theory? How do we talk about this? What is it beneficial for me? What's beneficial for the teacher? What's beneficial for the profession? Or is it beneficial to the community? It's important to analyze these very important issues. So another important lesson that I learned looking back over time, I wish I would have taught that class a little bit differently. But this is part of my journey, my self-analysis of who I am, and has taught me this lesson that I've carried with me. So after I ran that nonprofit and taught for a while, I decided to take a break. And last year, I decided to go back to work in New York City as the director for a program of deaf adults at LaGuardia Community College. You have to understand that that program has been running for 40 years, and I am their first deaf director. So thank you. I see some appreciation over there. So that's a really big step. And it's kind of an amazing experience to see the change of culture, the change from going from the hearing perspective to the deaf perspective, making it ASL centered. My views as a deaf person, those views that I bring to the program, is very inspiring to see. And honestly, it's inspiring to work there. And I love my job very much. So the program is called PDA, Program for Deaf Adults. It's in New York City at LaGuardia Community College once again. It's nothing compared to RIT, obviously. This is a much larger program, can't compete with that. But we do serve about 60 to 80 students. All of those students who want an associate's degree, we have that group. There's a group that do continuing education. Maybe they want their GED or a high school degree. Or we also have an interpreter training program. So we try to get these students fit these students into one of these three primary groups. And really, as my job as a director is very financially focused, as well as policy, making sure that we are compliant with the expectations, all of the legal expectations, educational expectations, many things. That is my day-to-day job. And really, that community college expects me to be able to go into a program and make sure that everyone has equal treatment and equal opportunities. And if you look at this picture on my PowerPoint to the right here, every student should have that equal access to information. I think that's something that everybody can agree on. But does that mean that students actually have equal access to the information that is presented? So for example, if I were to provide interpreting services, tutoring services, note-taking, mentoring, I can provide all of these things. My students do have access to these things. But does that mean that they're all benefiting from them the way that they should? Obviously not. I can see that in the audience. So that's where we get to the concept of equity. Equity really means that we're looking at what services we're providing, what courses we are providing, the intention behind our services. Those are the things that really make everyone work at the same, or provide the same access to information. It's not equal treatment. Just because one person gets a service and another person gets the same service, that's not the case. Sometimes we need to provide different services. So as an administrator, sometimes I have to remove a box from one person, and obviously that could have some backlash, but maybe the person who you can see in the yellow pants, should that person have to give up that access? Or maybe they feel that they don't have to give up that box. They feel that it's not fair if I take away their box. But if you look at the other two people standing next to the person in the yellow pants, have worked for many, many years to try to get that equal treatment, but they weren't able to have the appropriate access. They didn't have the same opportunities as the person in the yellow pants. So that is the concept of equity. So you can see that that is the heart of social justice, equity. How do we change the way we're thinking? How do we change the way that we view things compared to, from equality over to the concept of equity? It means that myself as a teacher, as a club officer, as an interpreter, as an administrator, faculty, whoever, whatever my role is, the population that I'm serving, I need to make sure that I'm providing the best services that I can, that everyone has this equity. Every person has the ability to feel comfortable and valued and have that access to everything that we're providing. So it's not good enough to provide a syllabus, a rubric. Obviously, we have these standards for expectations, but there's more than that. There's more behind that. Are we really preparing people for the material? Are we really giving them everything that they need to get access to this information?
And when we think about the heart of social justice, I'm not sure how we're able to manage this with such a large audience. But if I were to ask you the question, what does social justice mean to you? If you want to respond to this question, if you could come up to the front so that the interpreters and I are able to see you, in your opinion, what does social justice mean? You in the back, you can come on up. Just briefly, I was looking to see how one person would impact another person with their behavior. So analyzing how someone accommodates their actions or changes themselves for the better, for the benefit of all. And so Sasha speaking again. So how my actions and intentions impact other people. Does anyone else have an answer for what social justice means to you? There's no right or wrong here. That is the beauty of social justice. It is your own growth, and that will change, and your views will change, and how you pick up more of those ideas will change as you continue to grow. So any other ideas? Really, that's a good question, and a lot of my research and dissertation talks about equality, but to me, I think that's a good question. Social justice has to do with the system and how the system works to either promote or inhibit the concept of equity. And I think that you're right, that equity is a better term than equality. Sasha speaking again. So the system accommodating equity rather than equality? Okay. I see some people chatting in the back. I think that social justice for me, it's social. It involves people. We are responsible to create that equity and community. As individuals, we are the ones who have the ability to change the world, make it a better place. Sasha again. So how do we change the world, make it a better place? Hey everyone, my name is Joseph. For me, social justice, that's a huge topic. Talking about the system that has been set in place for so long. What does it mean for us who have the responsibility to view that system and also to figure out how to break down the systematic barriers? And what is our part and responsibility in doing that? Some have ignorantly supported the system for so long, and so trying to both figure that out and find a way forward, but also realizing that there's no goal that we're going to magically arrive to, that it's a process through our entire lives to continue to strive, to shift and to change that system, and it's going to happen over time. There are always going to be barriers that are still there, and we're responsible to monitor that, to make sure that we break down those barriers. Social justice, really I think it relies heavily on understanding one another, to listen truly to other people's stories. Often people think that you might be someone who has a strong grasp on social justice, but if you don't have the ability to empathize with other people, I don't think social justice will happen. Like you said, people who have compassion, who really have that heart understanding to be able to realize what the pain of it is and be able to make it better. I think that's what social justice does. My view on social justice is there's a lot of barriers to access and equality for everyone, but especially for minority groups, LGBTQ groups, people of color, the elderly, and those who go through different struggles, who have the things that they have to face in this life, have to be able to fight for specific reasons. Each of those groups have specific reasons, and it doesn't mean any of those are wrong, but often society is based on white, straight, hearing men, and we have to be able to fight to change that system that's been in place by those people for so long. This is actually very new to me, and I feel like how I view it is you have to start from those seeds that are planted, and then as it starts to grow and you learn how to grow, you'll also be able to figure out how to live better, and I think that's what I think of that. For me, I think it's about judging people the same regardless of race, gender, wealth, ethnicity. I don't know that, I think right now that a lot of times we judge people differently or prejudge them and have different precedences, which isn't fair. I think we should be able to judge people equally, and that's my vision of it. A few people did mention that it's not a singular issue. Does it mean that only people of color have to think about social justice, only the LGBT community, other groups, other minorities? It's true, there isn't one, it's not a singularity. It is an intersectionality issue. You cannot discuss social justice without talking about intersectionality. They are so closely linked. Intersectionality describes the overlap. Oh, hold on a minute. I know that this sign has changed over the years. There's been this idea of an overlap. Sometimes we talk about, again, there's like a core, and then we talk about other overlaps over that. But the point of intersectionality is that there are intersections, there are overlaps between different identities that we all hold, different oppressions that we have experienced, and again, that's not a singular issue. You cannot completely isolate all of these social justice issues into one singular issue. There are so many overlaps. If you see this diagram that I have here, we have identities related to religion, language, gender, identity, ethnicity, race. We have family status, we have gender expression, we have income level, we have aboriginality, we have ability. There's an idea of geographic location, of age, of sexuality, of occupation, of education. There are, I mean, this is just a very limited list. There's so many more we could add about the identities that we all hold. And I think within the deaf community, we focus so often on, through the deaf lens and through the language lens. And often we have to remember that all of these identities will impact your journey as well. How do I as a person, how do I as a woman, how do I as a person of color, I moved from another country, my parents' immigration status impacted me, my income level impacted me. How do all of these ideas impact my journey, my decisions, my choices, and how do all of these things influence what I view to be what I am, where I am most safe and where I am most welcome. And so again, we cannot talk about social justice without talking about intersectionality of all of these identities. And the concept was created by a civil rights activist, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. And she developed this concept back in the 80s and studied the Black identity and a woman's identity. Herself is a hearing Black woman, and she could not separate those two groups. It was impossible for her to study only women or only African Americans. And so she came up with the concept of intersectionality, but it really didn't catch like wildfire until about 5 years ago. But she really had honestly developed it a couple decades ago at this point. And in thinking about Black Lives Matter, I, for one, I am not an African American person. I am married to a Black man who is also deaf. And his journey, his path through the Black Lives Matter movement has been very painful. And it's been painful for me as a wife to watch when he sees things on social media, when we see the number of Black men who have been killed by the police force. But I, at the same time, while this is painful, I will never understand his journey. I'm not a member of that community. But he has many identities. He, of course, has all of these things that internet. He's not just black, he's also deaf. He's from Chicago. He grew up in a poor family. And the list goes on. And so his perception of that movement is different than other people who have different overlapping identities. Right now, I live in a very strongly Caucasian Italian community on Staten Island in New York. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the borough, but that's where I'm from. It was strongly Italian, strongly Republican community. And right now, if you drive on Staten Island, I'm not making this joke, I'm not exaggerating, every single tree on Staten Island has a blue ribbon tied to it. And what do you think that blue ribbon means? Right, support the police force. And every day, walking out of my home, getting into my car, driving to work, I see trees as I walk by, and I'm reminded every day, and my husband and my children are reminded every day that we are not safe. And I'm not a black person. But imagine, this is my family, all 3 members of my family. He gets out of his home every morning and sees a blue ribbon that tells him, I'm not safe. And this was also the town where Eric Garner was killed from he was choked illegally by a police who had attacked him and died. And I am from that same town, that same community. And so every day I see the blue ribbon tied around the tree and I am reminded of Eric Garner. I'm reminded of my husband and my children who have to be reminded of that. I have to think about my best friend and all of the communities, my family, my friends, who I love every day, that they're not safe. 1 month before the election, my husband was on his way to work. And he decided to stop by the store, and I think it was, or maybe it was Starbucks or something, so he went into the store. He came out of the store, and his car was damaged. And he was so confused. What had happened? Luckily, there was a bystander who said, the moving truck hit your car. It was a hit and run. They left. And the bystander took a picture of the truck. So they waited to see who owned the car, and they saw that it was my husband who owned the car with the license plate, and he said, thank you so much. Do you mind calling the police for me? He's hearing, the bystander was hearing, and they said, yeah, no problem. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. From 10 to 2 o'clock, 5 policemen came, left, saw my husband standing there, and left. Another one came, another one left. Not one officer asked, were you all right? Were you in the car? Do you need to be taken to the hospital? From 10 to 2. Not one officer out of 5. He called me at work and he said, my car was totaled, I'm waiting for the police. And my first response was, I said, please act white. I am a non-black person telling my African-American husband to please act white. And some people might laugh, what does that even mean? I don't know, honestly. I don't want him to be the next person to experience police brutality. I don't want that. We see that happening out in the community and country. And his fear, his experiences waiting for an officer to come and ask him, are you all right? That's one simple question. Or do you need to go on the hospital? Were you in the car? 3 questions. But not one officer asked him that, and he just stood there. And he also has to think about the idea of, will the officer bring an interpreter or anything like that? Finally, at 2 o'clock, a police officer came, took a 5-minute report, and then said bye and left. And he has not, of course, experienced that one time, but several. And that is part of his journey. So when we apply that to our community, to our students, to our faculty, to our staff, who are people of color, who are from other countries, who are even from here, their stories, their narratives, we don't know. We don't know what happened to them at home. We don't know their experiences growing up. We don't know what they have internalized when they're here. Maybe they're saying, I have language access, I have a community. But really what a lot of times they're going to be asking, am I safe? Will I experience discrimination here? And that is something we don't know. We don't know their hardship. We don't know their filters. We don't know their identity when they first come. And unfortunately, with this election, and pre-election really, we have to educate our students to become leaders, to develop our communities, to make a difference in their communities. We have been asking them to do this, to say, go be leaders, be job ready. You're deaf individuals and you can do that. But now, thinking of our political climate with our current administration, that is not the feeling of safety that I, as a person of color, or maybe I as a transfer student, or I as a woman, am I ready to be a leader in this political climate? Is something we might be thinking. Will I experience oppression? Will I experience discrimination? So as a professor, faculty member, administrator, how do I encourage my students to still rise above that challenge, still grow, still be ready to graduate and go out and get jobs when our community, our culture, and our country as a whole doesn't support that? So again, we can't talk about social justice without talking about intersectionality, and we can't talk about intersectionality without talking about the political and policy climate that we have. So if you think about, you have students who are from other countries, are they going to be sent back to their home countries? Do we have students of color who are going to be feeling afraid? As a staff member or faculty member in a classroom, how do I accommodate to make sure that my students feel they have a safe welcome? And that's tough. And it's not only tough here, I mean, it's tough at all colleges and universities who are speaking up everywhere. You see college protests going on all the time that are scrolling through on social media because people are afraid, and professors are afraid, faculty members are afraid, and it's a gray area, and it will be for the next 2 to 4 to 8 years, maybe. So it's time for us to come together and find how we can support those who have many identities and who feel oppression and exclusion and discrimination.
So as a short summary of my experiences as a student, a faculty member, as well as an administrator. Back when I was a student in my social work programs, fighting those battles, trying to keep the program, understanding that I lost, but there was finances at stake, and I understand that. At Gallaudet, we won, quote unquote, we became leaders, seeing those visions, but college was at stake. So when I went to, by college being at stake, I mean, potentially they could close. There were a few days for about a month that this horrible hunger strike was going on. So the accreditation was at stake. So the administration was watching. This is a school must run, and the government was watching that. And it's so odd because we want to serve our students, and we want our students to speak up. But the administration and the accreditation kind of goes against that. So how do we balance that between protecting our students, protecting the college, but also being overseen by this entity? It's not easy. It's a very strong gray area. And I remember this at Gallaudet as a student. I feel scared. We need to make sure that the campus doesn't close. So what kind of strategies can we use? What differences can we make in our approach in kind of fighting the system to make sure that our college is running all of the time? In the sense of being a faculty member with my research and my teacher, maybe my faculty, I kind of wish that they would have done some more for me to advise us, to consult with me, to shape the view that I was forming with my work. So I wish I had gotten some more feedback from my faculty at that time. And same with my role as a faculty. How do I teach my students to make sure that they have that cultural competency ongoing? It's not just one class or workshop. This is a full lifelong commitment. We need to make sure that we're constantly analyzing ourselves and looking deeper to find those oppressions and those oppressed communities that we do work with and serve every day. So now that I'm in the administrative field, it's quite a different perspective. There's policy and programs, budgeting, money talks. We have to understand this. So what does my boss want from me? What do the higher administration want from me? What do my students want? So we have equality, but my students want equity. These are kind of at odds with each other. How do we connect these two facets? So that's something, as my job as an administrator, I need to balance that. So how do I start that dialogue? How do we continue to find the area between these three of these, the commonalities between the students and the faculty, staff, as well as the administration? How do we make these work as a cohesive unit? So we have these three separate groups, and they all have their own responsibilities and their own reasons for coming here. So what is your common area between these three groups? What are the areas, and what are the areas that are not common? So in that common area, and that's the place that we need to start at. That's where the dialogue can begin. There are many, many issues that will come up as well. We have to understand this and unpack to try to find the first identify where we stand together, and then let that guide the policies and procedure. And then we can navigate and figure out the social justice perspective from each of these three groups. What can each of us contribute as a group to make this environment better, how we can make this a better place? So common areas, identifying the common values and goals that we share. That will become your intention activity. This will guide what you're going to do. So have you heard of the 3 F's before? Anyone heard of the 3 F's? So basically this is the food festival fun. For example, if you have an event that is hosted once a year, that's what we did. We did our part, we showed our diversity support, etc. For example, Color Fest is a one-time event, or Deaf History Awareness Month is 1 month, Black Awareness Month is 1 month. We have all of these various months where we're supporting, but that's not good enough. We've hosted these events maybe 1 or 2 times. We give food, people get together, they hang out, and then it's over. So that would be considered the 3 F's. But is that really intentional? Yes, people will show up, it'll be a good time, but then they leave, and that's it. But that's not an ongoing dialogue. We need to keep up that ongoing dialogue and commitment. But that is a good place to start. It's great if we can come and get together and start the dialogue, but it needs to continue outside of the festival. We need to keep that continuous throughout our lives. So any group who has experienced oppression and a person who is an ally need to figure out, how do we make this not a 3 F's event? I understand that we had this event, we had a great time, but how do we continue that dialogue? Where do we find that common area? You're a faculty, I'm a student. How do we find those common grounds to work together to start that dialogue? What are your interests and goals versus my interests and goals? And my priorities versus your priorities. We need to find those commonalities between us. That's where we can start. Because once we have these divisions, it's very, very hard to bring people together. So if we start with an approach where we're trying to find the commonalities, we'll be able to get that rapport and that chemistry between these 3 separate groups. So if you're a student here tonight, my advice for you is to share and find these diversity opportunities. I want you to embrace them. Go to different clubs, not just your own groups. If there's a different club that you're interested in, I remember we talked about the Dove Club in college that I was a part of. This was a place that we were able to share our concerns and have a voice and also identify solutions as well. And that's important, to be able to get these ideas out there, because be a part of that solution. It's more powerful to make that systematic change when more people are able to express their views and opinions. I also mentioned allyship. It's important to recognize people's issues. Maybe you don't identify with their values, but it's important to show that support. You need to show up when it counts. You need to show that community that you do support them. Be there, listen to them. As a student, you need to show up to other students' events to support other students. Listen to what they have to say and be there and support their values and identities. As a faculty, if you are a faculty here, it's important to rethink your curriculum. How are you engaging with your students? Take the time to think about it. Does my curriculum, do my goals, how can I accommodate to include more social justice and intersectionality perspectives into my curriculum? As for sanctuary cities and sanctuary curriculums, do we have any here? I think there are a few. We've heard of what sanctuary cities and sanctuary curriculums are, right? We have a few here? Basically, a sanctuary curriculum has become more popular now, where teachers are making an intentional effort to show diversity within their classroom, to address these issues, to have these research involved with their curriculum where people out there, all of the political issues, are trying to educate and make sure that they're being inclusive. Many colleges do have them now. For example, hosting town hall meetings every month. That would be part of a sanctuary curriculum. Being inclusive of other people's perspectives. How do we include diversity within our student body? And curriculum. And this is every day too. It's not just a one-time thing. It's important that you have these ongoing. So all of the material that you're using in your classroom, books and videos, who wrote them? Was it a deaf person, a person of color, a deaf person of color, somebody who identifies as LGBTQ? You need to take the time to look at your materials to see who it is representing. Find things that deaf people wrote, that LGBTQ people wrote. Are they inclusive? Are you including various perspectives? Are you including viewpoints of marginalized groups? What am I teaching? This can be the time for your students those students who came from those towns where they felt that they're the only person in their own identity. This is the time for them to come here to college and learn about themselves and identify with these different people until graduation. Once again, allyship basically means show up when it counts, all the time. You might feel that your teacher is safe. Maybe the administration, political climate feels a little sticky. Maybe it's not safe, but your teacher will be there. They're the person that is willing to listen. They will understand your journey, or at least listen to your journey, and that's very, very important as a faculty. So I worked really hard to think of an example of how a faculty can be an ally. For example, with my daughter, she's 5. She's 5, going on 15, that type, you know. Her name is spelled S-A-I-R-A. So it sounds like Saira. And that is an Indian name. I took the time to think of that, and my parents, and we worked on that to give her an Indian name. And so she will go to various doctor's appointments, meet with various nurses, when we go to the pharmacy to pick up her medications. Typically, I take her around with me. There was one day we had to go to all these different places on the same day, and everywhere that we went, whether it be the doctor, the nurse, the audiologist, all of them pronounced her name incorrectly. It sounded like Sarah, or Syria, Sierra, various different mispronunciations of my daughter's name. So my daughter, she's not exactly shy, but at the same time, she kind of understands that it's hard to critique people who are older, white, hearing. She very directly told them that that is not their name, or not her name, that you were not pronouncing it correctly. All day she did this, and I kind of watched her do it. She corrected the doctors and the nurses, etc. And I remember her telling me, "Mom, my teacher never says my name right. Over and over again, she mispronounces my name." And I tried to convince her that she should tell her. And she says, "No, I'm just not ready to tell her." She's been taught to respect her elders. Every day, my daughter has to be reminded that she's different. Every single day of her life. And she is the only one in her class who does not have a traditional American name. She is one in her whole class. So just by her name, she goes into the principal's office and he mispronounces her name. Oh, she goes into this classroom and her name is mispronounced. All of these different things, but she doesn't feel comfortable correcting her teacher. She feels that it's not appropriate. So as a 5-year-old, can you imagine? When she's 5, 6, 7, and so on. And hopefully by that point, once she's older, she'll be ready to correct people. But this is something she will experience every day, 18 years of her name being the only different name. As a reminder, you are different. And that is where the simple question could be asked. How do I pronounce your name? How do I sign your name? What is your name? Just to create that safe space where my daughter can feel that she can provide this feedback to her teachers. It's very small and seems very simple, but just this is many, many years that my daughter will have to go through this oppression that many other students experience, this language access that isn't being granted. So this will impact her growing up. This will be a part of her identity. She will recognize that she is the only person that is different within her classroom. So now for the administrators in the room. How do you balance equality with equity? What are the strategies? How do we switch over to that equity viewpoint? How do we include feedback from students? How do we better serve our students to make sure they have that equity with their services in their classrooms and getting what they're deserving? So cultural code switching. Maybe as deaf people, we understand this process of code switching. We're constantly trying to accommodate hearing parents, hearing teachers, trying to behave and match the hearing expectations that are placed upon us, speaking appropriately, reading and writing, being told we have to behave in a very specific way to match that hearing viewpoint of us, that sort of thing. But it's same for those of us who are deaf people of color. Maybe we're told we have to, or we can behave one way with our family and friends. This is my culture, my identity, etc. But then once we get to school, we have to code switch and behave in a different way. We have to match that white hearing perspective of us. And then when we go back home, we code switch again and can behave in a specific way. And then that's kind of a back and forth process that we go through every single day of our lives. And it can be exhausting. Talking to all of these different people, trying to figure out how to code switch and where to code switch. But that's a skill and it's not really fair. Is that equity? That being forced to code switch to match who you are around? So I'm only giving you one person of color as an example, but there's so many different examples that we have. So how do we make this an equitable situation? How do you fit all of your identities into this one cherished person just to be who you are? So as I'm thinking about code switching, and our students being forced to code switch to try to match what's going on in the system, am I creating this? How can I make these students feel equitable? How do I let students be who they are and really show their own identity? So without students, there's no program, right? So without the program, there's no college, and we wouldn't even be here. So our goal is to serve our student base. So we need to go back to our students, open up these dialogues, have these discussions, exchange our ideas. How does this benefit our students? That's the goal. How do we change this code switching system that we've set up? How do we better support? We need to listen to our students. And once we start that, that's great, but how? We need to get back to that base. We need to serve our base. Once they graduate, leave, go off to the working world, they should know that their base or their home is here. And as administrators, we can help foster this connection.
This is something for you to think about. Well, we don't have time for an activity, but as you think about the dialogue, the next forum, the next event, think about this Venn diagram and all those who are involved, the faculty, the administration, the students. We have differences, what are they? But what do we have in common? And start a constructive dialogue based on those commonalities, and not just the 3 Fs of festival, fun, and food, but how can you keep an ongoing dialogue? I admit completely that there's a Netflix documentary that came out recently, And it was talking about a group of Black students who were at the college and how they dealt with the different racial issues that went on. And within that group, there were 3 or 4 different other demographics about how they would approach racial issues. Some felt really optimistic or felt like they had to approach it very positively. Sometimes those groups felt like they should negotiate, and some were willing to openly protest. So each of them dealt with social justice differently. So again, it's not a singularity, but there is a variety of ways that students and groups can find a commonality to improve and change the system. When we think about allyship, what does that mean to us? Does it just mean that I get a little badge or a little t-shirt that says ALLY? No, it's an ongoing journey and an ongoing process in our lives. And it is, of course, dealing with showing up. It's a constant showing up, and it's a building of trust. I am someone who's attending. I am someone who's present. Our responsibility to be able to talk with marginalized individuals and communities. Allyship is not defined by one individual, but it's not something that we ally for ourselves. It is gifted to us. Who gifts me the identity of allyship? It's the community that we want to support and serve. They are the ones who are able to tell us whether or not we are an ally. I might be a well-meaning, very sweet person who shows up at every event, but whatever community that I want to serve must choose me and pick me as an ally. That is the true meaning of allyship. And there's a good example that I can think of. A long time ago, the deaf community, if you wanted to become an interpreter back in the day, the deaf people in that local community would discuss among themselves, and they said, we like that hearing person. They're an ally. We're going to invite them to become an interpreter. There was no interpreting certification before RID, before all of that kind of things. The deaf community said, you know what do you think about this person? Yeah, I think they're good. Okay, we're going to invite them to come within our community and become an interpreter. Later, that was taken over by hearing people who decided curriculum and levels and who to decide and what certification was. But we don't practice this kind of allyship anymore within the deaf and interpreting communities. Allyship means that I see you as an ally within this marginalized group, and I invite you into the community. And then you're able to show up when it's important all the time. And it goes both ways. The person who experiences oppression, you are the person who's responsible for identifying who is my ally, who is our ally, who do we want to welcome into our community. And on the other side, other people want to be viewed as an ally. So do I do enough practice and self-awareness to make myself welcome in that community? And so it goes both ways. And allyship is an ongoing. It's not a one-time meeting, it's not a workshop that you attend, it's something that's ongoing to continue to dialogue after you leave and to continue to show up. And I hope tonight, after the cell is finished, some of these thoughts will be buzzing around in your head, both who are your allies, but also what can I do to become an ally to different communities. And then Erin is coming back up onto the stage with a frame saying, thank you so much. We so appreciate you coming.